Welcome to The Explainer. Have you ever wondered why the exact same product, say a smartphone or a can of soda, costs something totally different when you're in another country? Well, today we're going to pull back the curtain on the complex world of international pricing and figure out exactly what goes into those global price tags.
It's a great question, right? You see it all the time when you're traveling or even just shopping online. The answer, it turns out, is not so simple. It's actually a fascinating look into the strategy that goes into running a global business.
So here's our roadmap for today's journey. We'll start with the big picture, the global pricing puzzle itself. Then we'll break down the basic ingredients of any price before we see what happens when you start pricing across borders. After that, we'll dive into the specific strategies companies use, and we'll finish up with some of the trickiest challenges they face out there. Okay, let's dive in. The first thing to get our heads around is that setting a price in a foreign market isn't just about converting your home currency. It's a really strategic puzzle with a lot of moving pieces. Think about it this way. A company just can't use a one-size-fits-all approach. The economy, the culture, the competition, it's all completely different from one country to the next. So it only makes sense that the pricing strategy has to be just as unique for each market. Now, what's really interesting is that before a company even considers going global, every single price tag you see is built on three fundamental ideas.
Let's break those down.
First up, you have your costs. At the very least, a price has to cover everything it takes to make and sell the product. But for international sales, that list gets a whole lot longer. You're talking about things like translating manuals, special packaging for a long journey, and all the logistics in between.
Next, you've got the classic law of supply and demand. You know this one. It's the ultimate balancing act. If a lot of people want something and there isn't much of it, the price goes up. If there's plenty to go around and not much interest, the price comes down. It's really the starting point for any price.
And finally, there's this idea of elasticity. All this really means is, how much will sales change if the price goes up or down? If you have a super strong brand with really loyal customers, you can often raise your prices a bit without losing too many people. We'd say the demand for that product is less elastic. So we have our basic building blocks: cost, supply, and demand, and elasticity. But what happens when that product has to cross a border? Well, that's when things get really interesting, and a bunch of new, complex layers get added to our pricing puzzle. These are some of the really big game changers. You've got currency values that are always fluctuating, import taxes called tariffs, different cultural expectations, environmental rules, and varying standards for quality. Any one of these can completely change the final price a customer pays.
This really gives you a great visual of the maze a company has to navigate. On one side, you have tariffs, which are pretty straightforward. They're just taxes on imports. But on the other side are the non-tariff barriers. And that can be a much more tangled web of specific regulations, product standards, and quotas that are often way harder to figure out.
And get this, culture itself totally shapes how we think about price. In so many parts of the world, the price you see on the tag is just a starting point for a conversation. Haggling is just part of the buying experience, which is a world away from the fixed price stores many of us are used to. Okay, so with all of these complicated factors floating around, how does a company actually land on a final price? Let's take a look at the strategic choices they have to weigh. Yeah, setting a price isn't just guesswork. It's a very careful, disciplined process. Companies have to look inward at their own costs and goals, and then they have to look outward at things like government rules, what the competition is doing, and most importantly, what customers are actually willing and able to pay. All of that analysis usually leads a company to one of three main strategies. There's skimming, where you start with a high price for a new, unique product. There's market pricing, which is basically just matching what your competitors are doing. And then there's penetration pricing, where you come in with a low price to grab a big piece of the market fast. A great real-world example of this is what Nissan did with their Altima car in the 90s. They launched it with a super aggressive penetration price, way lower than the competition. It was a huge risk, even their own finance team was nervous, but it absolutely paid off, helping them break into a really tough market. All right, now we're getting to the most complex and, honestly, sometimes controversial tactics in the entire global pricing playbook. These are the high-stakes moves that can really shape whole industries. A really hot-button issue is something called dumping. This is when a company sells its products in another country at a ridiculously low price, sometimes even for less than it costs to make them. The goal? To drive local competitors out of business.
And on the flip side, you have reverse dumping, where a company might actually charge more in a foreign country just because they know they can get away with it. And then you have this really fascinating concept called countertrade. This is essentially business without any money directly changing hands. It's a formal system where goods are paid for with other goods or services, and it's often required by governments. And this is way more than just simple bartering. For example, in what's called a compensation trade, a company might sell machinery to a factory, but part of the deal is that they have to buy back some of the products that are made with that same machinery. These can be incredibly complex arrangements. So, all of this leaves us with a final, really important question to think about. In a world with all these complex strategies, tariffs, and market forces, how do we balance a company's need to succeed with a system that's actually fair for everyone? That remains one of the biggest challenges in global business today.